This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Let's dive right into, Chris, the making of the actual movie, The Godfather. Let's set that up a little bit and dive right in.
To set the stage a bit, we have to understand that Paramount wasn't the successful company that it is now. Paramount very easily could have gone out of business at the time of the pre-production of The Godfather. They had a bunch of string of box office bombs. Like Paint Your Wagon was a box office bomb that went over budget. Charles Blue Dorn, he poured tons of money and manpower in another film called Is Paris Burning, which didn't do very well at the box office either. Like he hired like Gore Vidal, and like I read a little bit. I didn't watch the movie. I read a little bit about it, and I'm like, it seems like they spent a lot of money and they put a lot of work into it. I'm actually kind of interested in seeing that movie now. And Waterloo was another film that they did, which was it was generally well received, but it had a big bloated budget and became a box office bomb. And just kind of as a side note for film geeks, it's from what I was reading, apparently it's because of Waterloo is the reason why we never got Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon movie, because no studio would touch it because the Waterloo movie had lost so much money. Just to kind of set the stage, like now you guys kind of like understand the pressure that many of the main players were under during the making of this film, because if it failed, it really could have meant like the once proud studio of Paramount may have been done. I don't know. Did you guys know that Paramount was like in that dire straits, like leading up to the filming of The Godfather?
I had no idea. And I always thought of them as very successful, studio, and they've made some of my favorite movies. So that blows my mind that they were a whisper away from being out of business.
It makes sense though, now that you say it. Like Paramount did Star Trek, which was right about at this a little bit before this time. So they were taking a chance on a really weird sci-fi epic that really wasn't a thing at that time, like that sort of social commentary sci-fi. So that kind of makes sense now, though.
I didn't realize until I really started researching it just how dire it was. It was Charles Blue Dorn, who's quite a character himself, basically saved the company. And he was like a guy that like he sold like car parts. He was like a business magnate, and that's how he kind of got started, was selling like aftermarket like car parts and buying up like factories that were kind of going out of business and being able to turn a profit with them. And he wanted to be, I think he liked the attention of buying like a studio like Paramount, but at the end of the day, he was like a businessman. So he really wanted to turn it around. If he hadn't shown up, who knows, could have gone out of business.
So then how do we get Mario Puzo wrote this book? And it's unusual that he was brought on to write the script. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about this whole process of taking this pretty big book and then turning it into a screenplay.
Yeah, so Mario Puzo, he was hired to write the script for the film, which was at the time was an odd choice. It still is really an odd choice because generally studios didn't really hire authors because, right, as Frank will tell you, it's a different skill set, right? Like to write a screenplay and write a novel, it's two different things, really. Like that's why a lot of like directors will also write their own screenplays, because they're filmmakers. They understand like how to write a screenplay and how it works and what have you. But Al Ruddy, who we had talked about on the earlier, and wanted Mario Puzo to write the script, so he was hired to write the script. But as the studio was worried about Mario Puzo had never written a screenplay before, didn't even know how to start it. For weeks, he just didn't write anything. I mean, this is something that also followed Mario Puzo his entire life, where, he was a very talented writer, but the work ethic was not there all the time. He seems very much kind of like an artist, right? Where it's just, he gets a flash of inspiration and then everything comes out at once. He doesn't seem like the type of guy, like, I'm going to grind out the work and then, chisel around the edges type thing. After a few weeks of this, they actually brought Francis Ford Coppola on to help him with writing the screenplay, and they worked together for a bit, and then they went their kind of separate ways, writing their separate screenplays, but always kind of keeping in touch during the entire process. And it took them months to finish the screenplay, to pissing off Bob Evans and others at Paramount. The screenplay was finally finished on March 29th, 1971, at a massive 165 pages, almost 40 more than what Evans and Paramount wanted. And believe it or not, more was written at the time of the filming because the script wasn't fully done yet. 106. I don't know. I've never really sat down and read screenplays, so I don't. 165 pages seems like a lot. And it shows in the film. The film's almost 3 hours. So, you can imagine like the studio is saying like they want something that's like 40 pages less, and they show up with this after waiting months of getting nothing. And Mario Puzo not writing anything for weeks. I mean, I get it. Like, I'd be furious too. I think we got to kind of put ourselves in the shoes of the people at the time, right? Where, we know that The Godfather is going to be this huge box office success with like 2 other films, but at the time they didn't know that. They're trying to run a studio here.
An average screenplay, is anywhere between 90 and 120 pages, and it is a different style of writing. And in fact, most novelists who've been through the process will tell you that you shouldn't adapt your own work. And some of the reasons that they give is, obviously it's a different format, but also because it's a different format, different aspects of the story it's going to be important for them to be highlighted. And the method in which you highlight them might be different. And, somebody who is a director or a, screenwriter, and often, some of the directors are both, they'll see the story that way. And it's, a lot of times novelists aren't able to do that. And then of course, the other thing is the story has to be pared down. I mean, even an 80,000 word novel, you can't shoot the whole thing. It'd be a 4-hour movie, whatever. And so you have to pare it down to its core elements. And that's hard enough to do from your first draft of the novel to the final draft of the novel. You kill a lot of darlings along the way. And I can't imagine how difficult it would be to do that for film, all the things that you'd need to leave out. So, I was surprised when you told us that Mario Puzo was asked to do the screenplay, particularly since he hadn't done any before.
Not to go too far afield, but there was I think it was just a made for A&E movie on Moby Dick starring Ethan Hawke. It came out maybe 10, 15 years ago, but I thought that was, obviously Herman Melville wasn't involved in the making of the screenplay, but that one, if anybody goes out there, I think you can get it on the streaming services, like cut Moby Dick to what it was, like the essentials to make a movie. I thought for a movie that was essentially a made-for-TV movie, that one like sticks out in my mind more than anything, of a movie that whoever wrote the screenplay took that massive novel and sliced it down to its absolute essentials into about a 2-hour movie. It really wasn't even recognizable in the book except for the very broadest strokes.
Oh, it sounds interesting. I might watch that because I've always been scared to read Moby Dick just because I've heard there's huge sections of the book just talking about, I don't know, whaling. Like, I get it, but it just doesn't seem like something I'd be struggling to get through. type thing. It's like, get to the point, you know? It's
yeah, well, that's basically half of the book was a nonfiction book about whaling. And I think that for Puzo to get us, you know, to kind of veer us back onto the course is that Mario Puzo put in a lot of other material into that novel that it's pretty amazing that he was able to trim that out. I don't want to call it trim the fat because I think a lot of that stuff in the novel was interesting. And obviously, clearly he wrote it, so he thought it was interesting, but he was able to see that that was not an essential element for a film.
Yeah, well, Francis had a big part of that too, in terms of being able, like, they both did it together, right? So it's not like, oh, it was Francis was the genius behind it. It's like, no, Francis has helped in terms of Mario being able to focus on like the essentials of what made the Godfather novel such a great novel, and being able to translate that onto a screen, right? Like Francis couldn't have done it by himself because these were all the characters are Mario's characters, right? You know, and they're all accurately depicted in the film too, right? It's not like Francis changed up like a ton. He just helped Mario being able to write a screenplay and focus on the essentials, you know, less of the fluff that's in the book.
Well, and I wouldn't even call it fluff. But I would say you hit it on the head when you say the essentials. I mean, you have to find what are the bones of this story? You know, what is this story about at its core? And that is what every scene and every line by every character has to focus on, because we don't have time for anything else. And I mean, I can sit here and say that as a writer who's written, 40 books. I can't say it as anybody who's ever written a screenplay. So I don't know how hard that is to do that because I haven't ever done it. But I do know people who have, and I've read up on it, and I've never attempted it because of how difficult I think it would be to pare it down to that level. But point of record there, Steve, I do think that Herman Melville got an executive producer credit on that show. So
from the grave. Now, Chris, maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the issues. This is a fictional story about the mafia, but that doesn't mean that the real life mafia doesn't get involved.
Oh yeah, like right from the get-go, the mob was involved in the novel. You know, they weren't very happy about it, and right off the bat, as soon as like the genesis of this film was coming about, the mob was right involved. In particular, a gentleman named Joe Colombo, who we've talked about in our previous episode, and his Italian Civil Rights League. We talked a little bit about their involvement in the Godfather film, but we didn't really go into much detail. We're going to go into a little bit more detail here. Like I pointed out, Joe Colombo, along with many others in the mob, were pissed about the Godfather book. They viewed the book as racist towards Italians and playing on stereotypes that followed Italians ever since arriving in the USA. I will say that some of this is true. Hell, it still persists to this day, which isn't fair. But I will say there's an undeniable link between the mafia and the Italian community, right? There's no Italian mob without the Italian community, right? People probably get upset about that, but I mean, there's a little bit of truth in a lot of stereotypes. So, but we talked about on that movie, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. And, if you guys just see that movie, and it's like, I totally get where a lot of Italians were coming from, where it's just like, this is too much, man. Like you guys are making way too much fun of us. You talked about it on that, Steve, right?
Yeah, I mean, for sure that you can see, especially in this time period of the late 1960s, early 1970s, that civil rights leagues are popping up everywhere. And so whether Joe Colombo was it was completely cynical, or he really did believe that Italians were being smeared in some way, he had the muscle to actually do something about changing the course of a film like this. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, well, also like Frank Sinatra was also like very upset about the book and the potential movie too, because it was widely believed that the character Johnny Fontaine was based on him, and Frank felt that disassociation between him and Johnny made him look like a sexual degenerate, like a weak little crybaby. I mean, that's up to you guys to decide. Like, I've read a little bit about Frank Sinatra, and I don't think that's too far of a. I don't think that's too far off base. So, I mean, who Frank actually was. Yeah, and Frank Sinatra, he pushed hard on Joe Colombo and others to stop the movie from being made. He actually pushed so hard that his friends in the mob and the mob adjacent friends began to turn on him because they were just annoyed with him. They're like, just get away from me. Like, I'm sick of hearing about this. And, yeah, and according to, this is where I'm not exactly sure if this happened or not, but I'm going to go with it happened because it's a cool story. According to Al Ruddy, Joe Colombo threatened to use his Teamsters connections to make the movie impossible to make. And honestly, if Joe Colombo had done this, he would have. It would have been impossible to make because Joe Colombo had all his ties into the Teamsters unions, and without the Teamsters union and their labor, you wouldn't been able to just simply would not have been able to physically make this movie. And so Ruddy set up a meeting with Joe Colombo at his office, apparently right in Paramount, no less. And Joe had been demanding to read the script so he could read it, and which Ruddy was struggling to provide because Mario, as we talked about earlier, Mario and Coppola were having a hard time getting anything done. So he ended up getting his hands on a unfinished script and gave it to Colombo to read. And apparently so he had two henchmen with him, two thugs or what have you, and Colombo's there, and they're all in the office, and he gives them the script, and apparently Joe Colombo sits there and he stares at it for a bit, and then he hands it to one of his thugs to read. He looks at it and he's struggling to read it, and he hands it to the other thug and he's struggling to read it. And Joe Colombo gets all pissed off. He's like, "Oh, you guys are idiots. You don't know what you're doing." And he grabs the script again and he sits down. He's going to read it. And then he asks Al Ruddy, he's like, "What does fade in mean?" And apparently Al Ruddy said they're explaining to him, well, this is what it means, like, in terms of writing a screenplay. And then he apparently just, like, gets rid of the script and basically says, "You know what? I think you're a stand-up guy." He's like, "The only thing I'm asking out of you guys, if you can take the word mafia out of the script. It's a dirty word. It just besmirches all us Italians." And Al's like, "No problems, Joe. I can get that done for you." And not knowing for sure how many times the word mafia was actually used in the screenplay, he ends up asking Francis later. Francis is like, "Oh, I think we only use it like once or twice." So he's like, "Oh, it's okay if we take it out, right?" He's like, "Oh yeah, no problem." So he basically got like the union's support and the mob support by taking, I don't know, the mafia out of the script 2 times. Another example of like Joe Colombo kind of directly getting involved in the movie, the famous wedding scene. So they had secured that guy's house to film it. Francis had seen the house and he thought it was perfect. And then he backed out of it later, I guess maybe pressure from other Italians not wanting this movie to get made. Apparently Joe Colombo showed up to this guy's house and, gave him an offer he couldn't refuse type thing. And that's how they were able to secure that, the house for that famous wedding sequence is probably one of the greatest sequences ever filmed in world cinema history. Yeah, according to Al Ruddy, he's indirectly used Joe Colombo's muscle to make sure that they got that house. Yeah, that's like the more like kind of directly involved in it. And according to Al Ruddy, him and Joe Colombo had like a pretty good friendship. Like he invited him over for dinner and they were like friends. And people around Ruddy were telling him, it's like, this guy's a ruthless, like head of a mob family. Like, what are you doing? And I guess maybe they got along. I get maybe being a producer and, in a big Hollywood studio and, a head of a mob family, there's probably a lot of things they would have in common.
It's interesting to me how they went to such lengths to try to stop this movie. And yet it's like a favorite movie of all the Sopranos characters and, all kinds of Italian Americans today. My dad's half Italian and he loves this movie. It's one of his favorite movies. It's kind of interesting that they work so hard to stop it. And then it became this iconic movie that kind of meant something else than what they thought it was going to mean when they tried to stop it.
Well, I think a lot of the guys like higher up in the family were like worried about the attention that this movie and the book was bringing to the mafia, in the sense of the whole idea of the mafia is you don't want attention brought onto it, right? Like you want it to be secret. You don't want people knowing about it. You don't want people talking about it. But once they saw the popularity of the movie and it's, to a degree, it made these guys not look so bad. They're like, oh yeah, this movie's great. It's like, yeah, we're just like kind of running a family. And, like my grandpa's like used to run like an olive oil business and like we're totally not involved in drugs. And, didn't you see the Godfather movie? Like, Mike Corleone was involved in drugs. It was just gambling. And, he's a good guy too. Like, look, he saved his family and it makes them somewhat look, they look ruthless, but not as bad, like not as bad as they actually are. Like you can almost kind of root for these guys, right?
Yeah, it highlights two values that I think people really identify with. One is family. It definitely highlights family. And the other is honor. Especially Don Corleone. He exemplifies the idea of honor. And you pointed out that, I don't want him selling drugs. I don't want him selling next to schools, all this kind of stuff that the people can latch onto as being honorable, even though he's doing all these other terrible things. And so those two values, a lot of people have those two values. They may manifest differently, but those are values people hold dear. And so when you display those values, even under the conditions that you wouldn't find acceptable, as behaviors and situations, but the values are still attractive, you find yourself, still attractive. We did an episode on the Danbury Trashers a little while back, and we talked about Jimmy Galante, who, by all accounts, he confessed to a bunch of crimes and he was accused of more. But, to use your term, Chris, he was a stand-up guy, right? He did not roll over on anybody, not on his kid, not on his employees, and certainly not on his mob associations. And as much as he was kind of a, not an admirable person on paper, it was kind of hard not to have a little bit of admiration for him as you were watching this documentary that we talked about. And so it's almost involuntary as an emotional reaction that we're hardwired for. So when you watch The Godfather and you equate that to people who might actually be in the mob, that there's some transference there that happens, and it's kind of hard not to feel a certain way about Don Corleone, especially when he's playing with his grandson and, all these other images that Coppola really does such a great job shooting. I totally, understand why people love it now. So that's why it's even funnier to me how hard they tried to just, and then the other thing is everybody knows the harder you try to shut something down or keep it from happening or make it be quiet, the more people want to find out what it is and why you're trying to shut it down and make it be quiet. Married with Children probably wouldn't have been as big of a hit if it wasn't for that lady in the Midwest who, started a mail campaign to try to get it canceled, and making a big deal about it. And everybody's like, oh, what's this show all about that somebody wants it canceled? I think that may have happened a little bit with the Godfather. I mean, nobody wants this to be made. What is this that nobody wants to get made?
It tapped into a nostalgia, I think, being that it was set in the 1940s, and for the people who were older in the late 1960s, early 1970s, or the younger people, like my father watching it, he remembers going to big fat Italian weddings like that. And, the cousins and talking about gabagool and all that stuff. Like they tapped into that. And so I think that even outside of the mafia stuff, I mean, most people, maybe they knew somebody who was mob adjacent or in the mafia. I mean, every Italian American's family lore has, oh yeah, Uncle so-and-so was in the mafia. Probably wasn't. Maybe he was. But I think that it got people interested in their own culture. And I think it connected them to their culture, and probably it connected to that group of people at that time more than it necessarily does now. My kids are half Italian and they don't know anything about any of that stuff of, big Italian guys making a huge pot of sauce. But even I saw that to a much lesser degree. But people who lived at that time who were Italian American, like that was much closer to real life for them.
And like in terms of popularity too, like it just, bada bing. Like that's the saying that comes from The Godfather, and all these mob guys started using it because people loved it, and make you an offer you couldn't refuse. Like, regular people were saying this, and, a lot of these guys are just, at the end of the day, like, so, especially the street guys, it's, I don't know, like they're not much. If they weren't mobsters, I don't know, they'd be doing like roofing or something. You know what I mean? Like, not to like, you know what I mean? Like a lot of these guys are these types of guys, not to besmirch them. Like roofing it's tough work and it pays good. And
yeah, they're salt of the earth.
They see something that's popular and they're like, oh yeah, it's popular. People like it. Of course I'm going to use it, probably help me pick up girls or whatever, like it's like, it's just that type of thing, right? At the first they probably, I bet you most of these mob guys never even read the book. We were just talking about Joe Colombo couldn't even read a screenplay, they just saw that it afterwards. It's like, oh, it became popular, like why would people like these guys? Why would we not try to act like them?
So let's dive into a little bit of the production of, now we're getting into the nitty gritty of the production. So what were some of the controversies around how and where this film was going to be filmed?
Yeah, so right off the bat, they were fighting over the film was actually going to be shot. Francis insisted that the film had to be shot in New York because you couldn't recreate the feel and look of the film anywhere else. The studio felt like it could be shot in Kansas City, believe it or not. And now in the studio's defense, they were, like as we pointed out, they were a struggling company that was looking to keep costs down as much as possible to ensure like maximum profit. It's not like Paramount had a bunch of hits to look towards too, right? Paramount also wanted Kansas City, I believe it. Kansas and St. Louis was another one that they were arguing for just because it would be so much cheaper to do. But I'm like, you can't like recreate Kansas City, and you can't recreate New York and Kansas City. It's just not possible. Like New York's like one of the oldest cities in the States. It's like one of the first.
Maybe I'll be the odd man out here, but a lot of the movie, you think about it, the mall didn't really scream anything New York City. And that the scene, the couple of scenes, like there was one in front of Macy's, I think, or it wasn't even labeled as Macy's because they probably didn't get the rights to use Macy's. But I think that could have almost just been cut screens or B-roll and have fulfilled the task. I wonder if they could have filmed this in a soundstage and it wouldn't have made a huge difference. Like the fake snow, like the snow looks so fake in some of the scenes, or the scenes in the olive oil company look to me like a soundstage.
I still think you're talking heresy.
I guess. I mean, it's also like you have to like get the actors in to make them feel like they're in New York where the story is taking place, right? I get it's their job that they have to perform and it's their job to act like they're not themselves or somewhere else, but I just don't know. I don't see how you can recreate New York City and Kansas City or St. Louis. I just don't see how you do it. I really don't. I don't know. Maybe Steve, you're right. Maybe they could have done it. Maybe Paramount was right this entire time. They could have made even more money. Now, this is one of the more controversial things that Paramount wanted to do was Paramount also wanted to change the setting to modern times, arguing that the story could take place at any time and would help keep costs down in terms of costumes and set designs. I think you had pointed this out earlier, Steve, that this story could kind of take place at any time. I don't know. Are you agreeing with the studio here?
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. I think that Vietnam would have maybe been a little weird, but I think they could have made it work. I think, though, that the novel really, it had that 1940s feel and that vibe, and I think that it would have been jarring to change that, in my opinion, from the novel. And it really would have been, I think they would have had to have created a different story potentially for that to make that work. But I think the big picture themes could have fit into any timeline, but to totally change the novel into a different era might have been a little weird.
Yeah, it would have been a tough sell because like Michael Corleone coming back as like a hero from World War II. I mean, it's a war that we won. We're fighting the Nazis. Where if he's coming back as a war hero from Vietnam, especially at that time, it would have been a much tougher sell as him being a war hero. I mean, I think a lot of those guys were not treated very fairly, coming back from the war, but I mean, they're not in control of what's going on in terms of the political and cultural climate that was going on in the United States at the time. But, it definitely would have been a tougher sell as him coming back as this like kind of war hero, especially with all the anti-war protests and all that stuff that was going on in and around that time, right?
Yeah, and part of I think the important structure to the film is highlighting early on the vast difference between Don Corleone and Sonny, for that matter, and Michael, and for Michael to have joined the military is a big deal. And for him to be doing, fighting in the Second World War, which is considered by, people, more as a good war in terms of, it was pretty clearly defined what we were fighting for and who we were fighting against. And most people were in support of the war effort and so forth. It was very unifying. Whereas, as you very accurately point out, Vietnam would have a completely different complexion. He could still be rebellious and have gone and joined the army to go to Vietnam, but it would have been a different kind of rebellion, I think. So I'm going to disagree with anybody who says it could, not that it couldn't be, that you couldn't tell this story in any time, but I think it would change quite a bit if you removed it from the time that Puzo set it in. I think the nuances would be radically different. You could still tell a story of a family in organized crime and father-son strife and the son becoming the father eventually. I mean, you could still tell that story, but boy, the texture of it and the composition of it just would seem way different to me. That's just me.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, was that the basic theme of father-son relationships and three sons and who's going to be the son to take, it's a story about families. To change the idea that he created was definitely a 1940s book, and that is an indelible mark to the novel and then the movie as well.
And you captured something else, Steve, too, when you said that there's an element of nostalgia to this, and if they'd sent it, if they lose that if they set it in the current, what was then current time, and so that's just one more reason I think it was a good move to not listen to the suits in that respect.
It just got me thinking too, because if they changed the the time period, just came to me right now, like you'd have to change the lighting and everything, because like the way the whole movie is lit, it's like a lot of browns and kind of, it reminds me of Art Deco. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that type of style that was popular, but it's like a lot of browns and yellows, and it fits because that's kind of like the style at the time. Just came to me right now, but the other thought that was coming to me was it shows you just kind of a nice edge a movie sits on, because if the studio just put their foot down and said like, this is getting filmed in Kansas City, or we're filming this in modern times, Francis, take it or leave it, and Francis decides to film that movie, I'm sure he still would have made a pretty good movie, but he definitely wouldn't have been able to make the masterpiece that he ended up making. So it's, decisions like that, and it can come down to one person's personality, and that's the difference between a masterpiece and maybe a pretty decent movie.
So now we've gotten to the big parts, the casting choices. Let's dive in right into the Don himself. And Don Corleone is played by Marlon Brando.
Yeah, I think this is the part that probably people will find most interesting. Yeah, so right off the bat, Mario Puzo felt like the only man capable of playing Vito Corleone was Marlon Brando. He actually would personally write him a letter with a signed book asking him to consider playing the role. Francis felt the same way, Francis felt the same way, but considered Mario accepting the role in the studio, going along with it like a dream. Francis also felt that Laurence Olivier would be equally good for the role, but when they got into contact with him and his agent, they immediately struck down the offer, saying that they didn't want to get into sleazy mafia stuff.
Well, that's too bad, because Laurence Olivier would have probably rocked that role. I'm not saying he would have been better than Marlon Brando. You can't say that. That's sacrilege. But I think he, in an alternate history, he would have carried it off. It probably still could have been a classic movie, even if he were in the role.
That's kind of how I feel too, right? He would have been good. He would have been a good choice for sure. They could have gone with a lot worse. So, I can only, we'll get into it a little bit with the acting, some of the acting choices. The studio didn't want anything to do with Brando for various reasons. The studio pointed out that Brando hadn't had a hit in a long time, and his last couple of movies were big box office bombs. Brando was also infamously difficult to work with, having a wild temper, or drug addiction, outlandish requirements, such as like only working so many weeks and so many hours a day. That's like a couple examples. This is something that would follow Brando's entire life, right? It never ended. So, Francis, so on one day, Francis, Mario, and Ruddy all went to Brando's house after he accepted Mario's offer, and they did a little screen test without calling it a screen test, because they didn't want to offend Brando, asking him to do a screen test. And they were amazed, because apparently, like right before their eyes, Brando transformed into Corleone. He put this black shoe polish in his hair, and he put a bunch of cotton balls in his mouth, and did the accent, and they're like, that's the Don right there. This is how they describe the story.
Hey, Chris, had he read the book at that point, or was he just going off the screenplay?
I think he had read some of the book. After he had read some of the book, that's when he thought he could do the role. At that point, I think when they did that like fake screen test type of, not screen test, I'm not sure if the script was even fully done at that point. The studio had a few other choices of their own too. They suggested Ernest Borgnine, George C. Scott, Orson Welles were among others. And, I don't know. What do you guys think of any of those choices?
When you look at it, Marlon Brando, it's like looking at a picture of your grandfather. If you put somebody else in that place, it wouldn't be your grandfather. I mean, that he is Vito Corleone. I think my hot take on that is just that I think of all the other people in the movie, I think that he gets elevated in a lot of ways, but Al Pacino put on such a spectacular performance, and so did James Caan. And like, there's just so many great performances in the movie. And I think that Brando gets elevated above them. And I think that personally for me, Pacino just stole the show in every single way. So maybe that's a little iconoclastic, along with saying that it could have been filmed in Kansas City. But I just think that I couldn't imagine anybody else being Don Corleone besides Marlon Brando, just because I'm not that imaginative. And a fixture of all of our lives is that Don Corleone is Marlon Brando. But just watching the movie again, he was good. He was definitely good.
I think George C. Scott might have been able to pull it off. He's a pretty talented actor. Ernest Borgnine, he's an underrated actor, but I can't think of too many. I'm not familiar enough with him to know if he was a lead actor in a lot of stuff. He always seemed like he was a, second or third billing, sort of actor. I don't know if he could have handled that. And who was the third one that you mentioned?
Orson Welles.
Oh yeah. I mean, in an alternate universe where Orson Welles played that role. Yeah. I mean, you Italian him up a little bit with that voice of his. I mean, he could have rumbled his way to a convincing enough role, I think. Not to take away from Marlon Brando at all, because I agree with Steve. I mean, when you think of The Godfather, that's immediately the first thing you think of is Marlon Brando. And then you start thinking about Al Pacino because he's the dominant, Michael Corleone is the dominant character, but he's not usually the first character that you think of. I don't.
Yeah. So the studio would go back and forth for a couple of months, and obviously history's history, right? They decided that Brando was going to get the role. They were actually quite impressed with his screen test, not screen test, and the effort he was actually putting into trying to get this role. But they put some demands on him when he accepted the role. He would have to work for a lower salary, so it was 1.6 million is what I read, and he had to sign a waiver that if he caused any delays due to his temper or outlandish behavior, he would be removed from the film. And yeah, so the rest is history. Brando got the job. Maybe if Mario Puzo just didn't write him a letter, maybe none of this would have happened, right? Just kind of thing where, on a lark, he writes him a letter with a signed book, and Brando ends up taking the role. If he hadn't done that, maybe Brando just probably wouldn't even thought about it. Just weird kind of how, little things have to go right to make a film a masterpiece. And if little things just don't, then, we get a totally different person playing the Godfather, and maybe they do a terrible job and it takes you right out of the movie. In researching this and really getting this in the nitty gritty of it, that was the part that fascinated me the most, was just how absolutely perfect things have to go to create a masterpiece in filmmaking. Yeah, Robert Duvall, everyone kind of agreed that, yeah, we want him as Tom Hagen. So there was really no debate about that. The role of Kay Adams, there wasn't much of a fight from the studio either. Coppola wanted Diane Keaton, not only because, she's a great actress, but also she kind of has like a waspish look to her, which is what the character called for, right? Diane, to this day, she's still amazed that they cast her in the role, claiming that she felt like she didn't fit in with the rest of the cast, which I kind of get. They were all Italians for the most part, or a lot of Italians, or people acting Italian. And I mean, to me, that's exactly
acting, right?
And to me, but that's exactly the point. Is Kay had to act and look like a total outsider, which was her role in the book and the movie. She's an outsider, like from this WASP culture, kind of going into this Italian mafioso La Cosa Nostra culture, right? That's why it works, right? She doesn't look like she fits in, at all, because she doesn't. And they get into that later in the later movies, just how much she doesn't fit in The Godfather Part 2 and The Godfather Part 3. I guess this is what the audience would find most interesting was how much people did not want Al Pacino to be in this movie. So I guess we'll get into this in a second. Now we get into the most debated casting choice of Michael Corleone. I say to really understand why the casting of Al Pacino was such a hot button issue, we have to forget pretty much everything we know about his amazing performance and the success of the movie. Coppola wanted Pacino right off the bat, saying he looked the part and that Pacino was a phenomenal actor. Where Coppola wanted Brando, he potentially saw others being able to pull off the role. When it came to Pacino, he was steadfast in his belief that no one else could pull off the role of Michael Corleone. Paramount wanted a big name actor to play the role for obvious reasons. As much as everyone will say they aren't seeing a movie because of an actor or an actress is in it, they're, to put it bluntly, they're full of crap, because the reason certain actors get paid the big bucks they do is because they bring the big bucks in. It's as simple as that. Because people want to go see them. The studio initially wanted Warren Beatty or Robert Redford for the role. And, I said, let's just take a moment and think about the ridiculousness of Robert Redford playing the role of Michael Corleone. I couldn't believe it when I was reading that. Warren Beatty, I can kind of see. Robert Redford, for real.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Yeah, Warren Beatty has the look, at least. I don't know. I haven't seen enough of Warren Beatty to say if he could have pulled it off or not. Would he have been about the right age at that time? He always seems old to me. I don't know.
The only reason I kind of think that he might have been able to pull it off is because, he played Bugsy Siegel in the movie Bugsy, which is an interesting movie, but he played a gangster and he played detective type roles and criminals and stuff. I can kind of see it. Robert Redford, I don't know. Me and my wife were talking about that and we were just blown away by, I don't know. Can you imagine if they cast a Robert Redford? Probably would have ruined the whole movie. Not that he's a bad actor. Just not for that role.
Yeah. I think we had to talk about this off mic at one time, like a month or two ago. And the point I made then, I still stand by. I think Redford's an excellent actor, and I think he could have done a yeoman's work in this role, especially if they dyed his hair, and he worked a little bit on the accent or whatever. But, Pacino brings such I can't remember the way I described it. Maybe you do, Steve, because it was you and I think that were having the conversation, but he brings this icy malevolence to the role, this intensity, that this calculating, this deadly calculating sort of almost shark-like, but hidden underneath. It's subtextual a lot of the time. And, I don't know that, Warren Beatty could have done that. I don't know that Robert Redford could have done that. He was great in Butch and Sundance, and he was great in The Natural. And he's an excellent director. And The River Runs Through It is a great film, and all kudos to him. But boy, Pacino's portrayal of Michael Corleone has an element to it that I don't know that a lot of actors could have brought. Ironically, I think De Niro is one of them, but there aren't many.
Yeah, he has all of that energy, and you can, in other films where that energy comes out in different ways, but it was in this particular role where he focused it all, and it just all came through in his facial features and the way he would stand. And even if he was just standing still, it came across as motion and emotion. It was pretty amazing. It was amazing.
Well, the person that was most against Al Pacino getting the role was Evans, who felt, for two reasons. Literally Al Pacino was a no-name actor. I think he had done one film I think it was like, I don't even know if it was like a real film. I think it was got a short before The Godfather. And he had done a bunch of theater stuff, but actual film, nobody knew who he was. And he said he was too short. He said that he was like, the audience just wouldn't take him serious. But I mean, I don't know. He's an Italian. Like, I mean, what Italians kind of, not that every Italian is short, but they tend to be on the shorter, squattish side, right? It's just part of their genetics.
We're mountain people, Chris. We're mountain people.
You know, like, no, it's the truth. You know, like when people think of Italians, they think of like, you know, Stallone. You know, he's jacked, he's huge, but he's short. You know.
So, how tall is Tom Cruise? I mean, he's a lot shorter than people think, and I don't think Pacino comes off looking small in stature at all. And some of that might be the way that they filmed him, you know, but that doesn't surprise me that that's a bias, particularly in, you know, when was The Godfather made? 1972. You know, that a lot of biases existed in 1972 that we wouldn't find very helpful today.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, I don't know. He's playing, I don't know. I just don't get it. I'm like, he's playing an Italian, and you know, your complaint is that he's short. I'm like, I don't know. Like, Italian people tend to be on the shorter side. Not all of them, but it is like a thing. Like, you think of like Swedes, it's like the tall blonde guys. It's like, oh yeah, not every Swede's tall, but they tend to be on the taller side. I mean, look at the Saws. I'm trying to think, those two brothers and the father, this Skarsgård, or one of them was in that movie, The Northman. I'm trying to think of them.
Mm-hmm.
You know who I'm talking? Yeah. Like, you look at those guys and you look at them, it's like, yeah, someone like that, like they're like North German or Swedish. I'm like, yeah, I totally get it. They look it.
Who are some of the other people? Because they really seem to be going down a checklist of people to come up with anybody besides Al Pacino, and they keep going seemingly further and further afield from Pacino-like actors.
Yeah, the studio, they tested Dustin Hoffman, Dean Stockwell, Martin Sheen at one point, James Caan. Well, James Caan would end up being in the movie, but he didn't get the role of Michael Corleone. And in one of the more bizarre stories about the making of the movie, but apparently Burt Reynolds was offered the role to play Michael. And apparently when Brando heard that this was the case, he threatened to quit the movie. And, you know, once Burt Reynolds heard, he just left himself. as soon as he heard that Brando was going to quit. Burt Reynolds. I don't. I like him, like, in some movies, but I just, that would have been a really odd choice to play an Italian as Burt Reynolds. But I mean, I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think Burt Reynolds could have pulled it off? I don't at all.
You know, most of his work prior to that time was serious work. I mean, he hadn't gotten into the, you know, Smokey and the Bandit stage of his career yet. He was still doing like Gator and, you know, those movies. And, you know, The Longest Yard was a couple years later, and Deliverance obviously came out the same year. That was huge. I think he's underrated in his ability too. I think people think of him as a one-trick pony and, you know, a mustache who can giggle and drive a Trans Am. And certainly he did that in some of those movies. But, you know, I mean, he was in a movie called Stick that was really good. And
well, you mentioned the Deliverance, like the Deliverance was fantastic, right? I just can't see him playing that role though. It just maybe
Sharky, he was good in that.
I have to say, I would like to see the alternative universe Godfather with Burt Reynolds or Dustin Hoffman or maybe Martin Sheen. I'd be interested to see them and see how they took the role in maybe slightly different directions. Because Martin Sheen, to me, he honestly seems like the least likely. Not that he's a bad actor, but I don't see necessarily that intensity that Al Pacino brought. But maybe I'm wrong on that.
No, I think you're right about the intensity. I will stick to that, you know, maybe maybe, I think De Niro, in a more quiet way, could have brought that to the role if he had been selected. There are a couple other actors maybe that could, but Martin Sheen's a great actor. And, he worked with Coppola later in Apocalypse Now. I get why they didn't want to do Pacino, though. When I looked him up on IMDb, when Chris said he only had a few things, he only had 3 things, and none of them were big movies at all. He really was a no name, and so us second guessing him a little bit, we might be putting on our 2020 hindsight glasses with this one.
Well, no, I get like where Evans and the studio's coming from. They're like, why are you so insistent on Pacino? Like, we can't sell, like, it's going to be hard for us to sell this movie as our lead actor or somebody that nobody's ever heard of. And we need this movie.
But they could have gotten around that, though, Chris, if they had, and they kind of did initially by, pushing Brando as the lead actor. I think that's what I think that's why they ended up doing it, right? With Brando on the cover and everything. And how big I'm trying to think how big James Caan was at that point in his career.
He had done a couple of things, because the studio was big on James Caan. They wanted James Caan in the movie.
Caan's first entry on IMDb, it's a television entry. His first several are, but it's dates back to 1961. So obviously he'd been in the business for a while. He was on Wagon Train. He had a bunch of other things, but I'm not seeing, he did some guesting on. Yeah. When I look at this, the Godfather is his first big movie. I guess he was in Brian's Song, which was a TV movie that was really big at the time. I don't think it's really held up maybe to history as well as its popularity in the moment. So maybe they were writing off of that he was, this heartthrob sort of inspirational story the year before. But he's, he's been in the industry for a while. He's not complete no name, but he's not huge.
Well, the studio also thought Jack Nicholson would be good for the role. And apparently they offered him the role of
Michael.
Wow. Yeah. And, Jack he turned it down, claiming like he thought it would be ridiculous not having an Italian play the role. And I think I tend to agree with him on I tend to agree with him on that. But apparently the studio was like, it's your job if you want it. I bet you he regrets that decision because, that probably would have been his. He had a bunch of big hits, but that probably would have been his biggest hit, right? But I don't know if he would have been able to pull it off or not. He definitely, you guys talk about the intensity. He definitely would have brought the intensity. It just would have been a different type of intensity.
Yeah, his is more crazy intensity, like, like a Screw Loose stuff. Like
I could see him playing Sonny.
Yeah, I could see him playing Sonny maybe.
And doing a really good job at it. James Caan was really good at it too, but I can't see him playing Michael because you guys brought it like icy, steely, quiet type of intensity that's mainly conveyed through Al Pacino's eyes, really. And it's there
the whole movie. Like even when he's in his, I just kind of joked about that line, "I'm not my father," Kay, that he delivers something that's I think a pretty close quote at the wedding, when in the scene where he tells her about the band leader and the offer that he can't refuse story. And that's kind of the punchline to it. "I'm not my father," Kay. Even then he's got that intensity. It's just, he's using it to kind of be aloof from his family. And then it shifts, as the story and the film progresses. And dials up a little bit too, but it's there the entire time.
And his character too, where, when they show him in his Marine uniform, and you have to put that in your mind that he's seen horrors that these mafia people could not even imagine in a million years. But also, he can't really imagine their world either. It's such a strange dichotomy that they give us with the returning war hero. I don't know if they do say that he was in actual battle and combat, and they don't really understand his world and he doesn't entirely understand their world. And I think that that is one of the most fascinating parts of the movie, or at least that early stage of the movie.
Well, the studio ended up agreeing that Pacino would get the role, but Robert De Niro is actually involved in this story, believe it or not. Pacino was convinced that he wasn't going to get the role based off what other people were saying, and he had signed up to play in the movie The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. Me and you, Steve, have talked about this movie. It's loosely, somewhat, kind of based off Crazy Joe Gallo's life, sort of. And he was going to play the Italian immigrant role, or the Zip role, I guess. And that's a little like Zip was like a Sicilian, the newly arrived Sicilian in New York that was like kind of mafioso. But so he took that role, and then Paramount had to get involved and basically got him out of that contract and said, well, we have this guy De Niro who would be good for the role too. So they offered him, it's like, okay, you give us Pacino, we'll give you De Niro. And so De Niro ended up being in the movie The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. Paramount ended up getting Al Pacino, all that fighting, and then they had to do more fighting just to get him back when they could have had him initially. And so, and then James Caan was ended up getting the role as Sonny, as a second prize. I don't know, that'd be a weird way of putting it, but in some ways it wasn't the lead role, but we want you in the movie and here's a role that we think you'd be good at. So I don't know. What do you guys think about Robert De Niro having a connection to this movie? And which is, you guys kept on bringing up Robert De Niro, and I was like, of course, like, why not? In such a weird kind of way too. That movie, The Game That Couldn't Shoot Straight, though, like, I don't know, watch it and listen to the podcast that we, did on it, because it's interesting, but I don't know, it's not the greatest movie.
I haven't seen it, so I can't comment. You guys are the experts on this one.
Yeah, you should go and see it. It is something else.
It's pretty out there. Like, I don't even know how to. It's a comedy, right? It's like, it's kind of like a goofball. It reminded me a bit of like the Naked Gun movies, sort of, in that vein of like the spoof comedy. I don't know. It wasn't very good. I don't want to kind of go into The Game They Couldn't Shoot Straight, but I just thought it was funny because we had talked about that movie and we talked about Joe Gallo. We're talking about The Godfather, and we're talking about like Pacino and De Niro always seem to be kind of connected in some way. We're like, oh, like, you know, De Niro could have done that role, or Pacino could have done that role. Like you can kind of switch them in and out. Both famous Italian American actors. I thought that was like one of the funnier bits in researching this, the history of this movie for this podcast.
And then wrapping up, you have a little fun side note. We've, if anybody follows us on YouTube, you've done a short on this person, but the person who played Luca Brasi, he's not the biggest part of the whole movie, but has a little bit of an interesting background.
Yeah, I didn't think it was really necessary to like go through all the roles. I didn't really find it interesting myself, and maybe I just assumed the audience wouldn't either if I wasn't finding it interesting. But I wanted to make mention of the character Luca Brasi. Lenny Montana was who plays the character Luca Brasi. He was actually a professional wrestler during a large portion of his life, and he was actually an enforcer for the Colombo crime family. During the filming, Francis and Ruddy both caught sight of Lenny, who was being a bodyguard for one of the Colombo family members that was on set. Standing at 6'6" and over 330 pounds, Lenny looked like he was practically made for the part. And so when they got Lenny to read from the script, the genuine way in which he struggled, Francis thought was perfect, because of course a man that knew nothing but violence in his life would have difficulty doing something like that, just reading a letter that he wrote himself. And the rest is history, really. Just kind of by accident, Lenny Montana ended up putting on probably one of the best bit roles ever in mob movie history. I mean, he's only in the movie for a little bit, but everybody loves Luca Brasi, you know, and he plays it perfectly.
And Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes is one of the iconic lines that comes out of the movie, right?
You know, and him getting strangled too, right? Just a little side note, like that actual strangling part is, you know, he suffered some serious damage because he came from like a wrestling background where, yeah, it's fake, but they put the chokes on in such a way that it looks somewhat realistic, right? So they do have to apply pressure. So when they were doing it, he's like, oh, just keep on going harder and harder and harder. And he said like he literally felt like his eyes were going to pop out. When that wasn't acting.
It looked like it on screen too.
You know? So yeah, and it was like take after take after take. And he was like, he started getting pissed off at one point because he was like, Francis, like, you don't have it yet. He was like, no, 2 more or something like that. So, yeah, you know, now that we have the early parts of the filmmaking process in place, let's next week actually do a proper review of the Godfather movie and put into context just how important this movie was in terms of pop culture, but and also how the mob viewed itself.